Hello and welcome. My name is Dan Meyer. I'm the editor-in-chief of RCR Wireless News. Joining me today is Tom Burson, who is the principal at Pace Harmon. Hey, Tom, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Well, hi, Dan. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Great.
And yeah, and I just thought I'd spend a quick 30 seconds or a minute giving you a little background on me and the firm, Pace Harmon, who I'm with. I'm a principal at Pace Harmon. Pace Harmon is, I've been with the firm for 10 years, started in 2004. Pace Harmon is a sourcing and outsourcing advisory firm. We focus exclusively on assisting Fortune 500, to some extent middle market companies, in a number of different industries. Wireless is one of our prime segments that we work with. I've worked exclusively with wireless companies for the 10 years I've been with Pace Harmon, and for about a decade before that. So we have, as a team in our wireless network service line, a number of people with very, very deep experience, both coming from industry and consulting experience. When I said we focus exclusively on sourcing and outsourcing advisory services, as it applies to, particularly in wireless, what we do is assist carriers, and to some extent Tier 1 vendors, but mostly carriers in OEMs with their sourcing needs. So if they need to build a network, we assist our clients in negotiating, developing, running requests for proposals for site development services, for the technology end-to-end on a network deployment. And to some extent, and that takes us all the way through contract negotiations, which we support, vendor selection, all of that. And then we also do assist in developing the processes and implementing those to bring the new vendors on board, or to sometimes we help our clients migrate different functions in-house and to some extent out to the vendors as well, depending on what direction they're going, ranging from operations to deployment. So we touch pretty much every part of the wireless carrier, if you will, and not just on the network side, but that covers customer care, logistics, you name it, we do it.
That sounds good. Okay, very good, interesting. Well, I know one of the topics we want to touch on a bit today was looking at kind of the network decommissioning angle. I know we talked a little while ago on a report that we did on the topic, and I was hoping to get, I guess, some more insight from you on kind of that topic. I mean, obviously, from talking with you previously and kind of doing the report that we did on this topic as well, it seems like, you know, network decommissioning is I guess, depending upon the carrier, I guess in a different time frame, you know, like I said, depending on where carriers are. It does seem like it's a topic that's getting some momentum. Obviously, as carriers are looking to deploy LTE services, they could be looking to take down some of the legacy networks, whether it's 2G or 3G networks, to help support LTE, whether it's more spectrum or equipment or whatever it is to help support LTE. So hoping to get from you today perhaps a little more insight into kind of where we are in network decommissioning. So I don't know if you maybe start off with, I guess, your general overview of perhaps where you see the decommissioning network when it comes to where wireless carriers are along the process there.
Sure. So when we talk about decommissioning, a lot of different images come in people's minds. People usually think about physical, taking down equipment. You know, in the public, a lot of people think it's, oh, that tower in my neighborhood's going to come down. There's actually a fair amount of articles out there in local papers about, well, you know, so-and-so's taking down they're decommissioning their network. When's that tower going to leave? And it's the switch from 2G to 3G, and particularly skipping up to 4G. It is very much a physical challenge. We're talking ripping and replacing equipment, not necessarily towers, and we'll get to that in a minute. But from 3, so there's a lot of obsolete 2G equipment, and that impacts a lot of the downstream things you have to deal with. Going from 2G to the next level, or the next couple levels. So you do have a lot of obsolete radio equipment, shelters. I mean, a big part of this is when you're getting to 3G and 4G, shrinking the footprint of the site and so forth. But the jump from 3G to 4G is a much different animal when we're talking about decommissioning. It's much more of a to a large extent a software change, especially if you're going from, say, UMTS to LTE, which is, you know, something we see, or even HSPA. in a lot of cases, it's simply replacing a card in a radio. You might be putting some new remote radio units on top of a tower where there weren't some before. And again, this is 3G to 4G. But if you look at the bill of materials for a 4G deployment that's layered on top of or replacing a 3G network node, say at a node B to an E node B in the LTE lingo, a lot of it is you're not talking about necessarily a ton of hardware leaving the site. Now you may still have a lot of legacy stuff like your shelter that your 3G stuff was in, and you just don't need that anymore because you had that shelter for 2G, for instance. So yeah, the shelter may go. But I think your question had to do with some of the challenges, and correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have a whole bunch of different challenges with all those, but the common challenges you're dealing with start with the customer experience and managing the expectations of the customer. That's obviously first and foremost, in making that as painless and seamless as possible. That has to do with things. This is just logical as the handset strategy. You know, if you're going from, for instance, I don't know, Iden, you know, the old Nextel, to okay, we're putting that, and that's a prominent example in the market, of course. Okay, we're just going to stop support. The carrier's going to stop supporting that by the end of whatever year it is. I think it's 2014 or what. You know, stop supporting the handsets. And you know, fortunately, most people at this point kind of want the latest and greatest handsets anyway, the way that those things are going. So there is a customer management aspect of it. And then to make sure it's seamless, there's a meticulous planning and program management angle to all this that has to do with being very, very careful about when you're taking down a cluster within a city or an area within a city, and then putting the new network live and having your customers immediately be able to migrate with their new handsets over to that. So there's a big kind of deployment in decommissioning nexus that's very complex, and you do want first-rate program management to oversee that. And when it comes to program management, I look at decommissioning very similar to the way I look at deployment in the first place. You need to have a dedicated PMO team in management, in governance, decision points, even sourcing strategy. I talked about, we do a lot of sourcing, obviously, and some of the decisions you're making around sourcing for decommissioning are very similar to the ones that you're making on deployment to begin with. Do you go with a tier 1 vendor, you know, someone like a Goodman or a Teltec, who can then bring in the subs to do some of the unique things having to do with decommissioning, like recycling and wiping data off machines? But you also have tower climbers. You see those in deployment and decommissioning. Real estate is a gigantic issue. It's complex, and I think we're going to talk about maybe the impact of decommissioning on towers soon, but in this conversation. But you do have to negotiate. There are negotiations that are going to have to happen with the big tower companies, the American Tower, the Crown Castles, and so forth. But once, just sort of assume that way for a second, that you will get a deal with them and work everything out, you, the carrier. You've also got lots and lots of these smaller players, and that's where things can get a lot more challenging. Again, going from 2G to 4G, just like with the physical aspect of it, from the legal, the real estate aspect of it, sometimes even the zoning and permitting aspect of it, it's a much more challenging thing.
Yeah.
You know, talk to your landlords about the lease terms and the you know, what does it mean to them that site access. You got to get your tower climbers up there to get the stuff out. Sometimes these landlords and mom and pops don't like that. They're not in a hurry to let you to do that.
Exactly.
But yeah, so I'm probably getting a little bit ahead of your question, but there are quite a number of challenges. So operational, customer management, operational coordination, real estate, and then basically your strategy with your vendors, and how do you quickly manage, get that under control, and make sure there's a clear division of responsibilities among all the vendors and the people in the house. Again, it's not that dissimilar to managing a network deployment.
Yeah. Well, I know when I was working on this report, that was one of the topics that came up quite often was the project management aspect of it. And it does seem like that is, I mean, that's probably key to the whole thing. And obviously, taking apart a network, like you said, is similar to building a network. It's a huge project.
It is.
And if you don't have the right pieces in place at the right time, you're looking at, people just spending around doing nothing for the most part. I mean, you got these, like you said, you got tower climbers out there, and if they're unable to get access to a site at a certain time, you're wasting their time, and it's the whole thing kind of starts falling apart, it seems like.
Very much so, and that's why, in my opinion, this opinion, and folks may differ, but when you're talking about a large-scale decommissioning effort, and again, and this really doesn't make a difference whether you're going from 2G to 3G or 3G to 4G or beyond, you want to have a dedicated team that's running the project. You can't have part-timers like, okay, in the morning I'm doing deployment, in the afternoon I'm going to do decommissioning, or the way that typically is, this minute I'm doing deployment, and the next minute I'm doing decommissioning. You really do want that. And then the next thing is best-in-class vendors, PMOs, people who do this. The vendors in the space, it's again, I keep going to analogs to deployment. You've got companies like, I think I mentioned them already, like a Goodman or a Teltec, but you also have, Black & Veatch plays in this. Some of the infrastructure deployment vendors, because they have the relationships with the tower climbers, they have relationships, well-established whole stables full of site acquisition, real estate types.
Mm-hmm.
So from a sourcing strategy, there are firms that come at this from different angles, OEMs for that matter, because a lot of times you've got deals where your OEM vendor for your 2 or 3G will essentially swap in, and we've negotiated a lot of those kinds of deals where, okay, when you migrate from 3G to 4G, you get a credit, but if you're taking the card back, we want the card because we can maybe reuse it for some of our other customers, or that kind of a thing. So you've got OEMs playing, you've got the infrastructure vendors. The Black & Veatch always comes to the fore when I'm thinking of those kinds of companies, and then companies that kind of specialize in this stuff. The main thing is think of them all as tier 1 players who will then bring the subs in, because the alternative is you manage all these subs yourself. You manage as a recycling vendor. You're managing the real estate folks. And a lot of these are local people because of the logistics involved and the relationships. And you really need to think really hard if someone thinks they're going to manage that in-house. You do want, again, a really solid governance team and PMO team in-house, but you do want to kind of hand this whole thing over to 1 or 2 players, depending on geography and other things, that can then take care of all the local and small vendor, essentially like a general contractor, a tier 1 vendor. Yeah, it's a good way of approaching it and de-risking it.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I guess how far along, the process are we even? It does seem like, at least here domestically, a couple of carriers are, have been doing decommissioning here for the past couple of years. Sprint, for instance, has been pretty aggressive in doing some stuff, and some other carriers as well are looking at doing it more and more. Is the industry learning quite a bit when it comes to decommissioning? Is it becoming an easier process, do you think? Are steps being put in place that are making this easier, or is it still kind of a Wild West out there when it comes to some of these efforts?
I wouldn't call it Wild West. There have certainly been, from what I've seen, I can't mention carriers. I'd love to, but I can't. I've seen some really, actually fairly surprising success in terms of speed and efficiency in getting this done. So I wouldn't describe it Wild West. When I use like Wild West, I think of sort of the network deployment era, the real rapid growth, land grab kind of era from, the early 90s to, maybe 2005 or 6 or something like that, where people were just like, build it at any cost and we'll deal with the other issues later. By the way, so to get your point, no, I wouldn't describe it as it's because a lot of these vendors are fairly mature. Number one, there's a lot of wireline decommissioning experience that transfers over to wireless. That's sort of another one. And a lot of it is you are using a lot of the same people. From, if you look at the kind of end-to-end, what's the word? Not really value chain, but sort of the end-to-end function list of the things that have to happen. Again, I go back to, tower climbing, program management, all that. These folks have been in the business now for a while. Mm-hmm. Now, does that mean it can't turn into a real mess real fast? Yes, it can. And again, back to this whole program management thing and vendor strategy, that has to be planned out and implemented flawlessly. But that's the same thing for network deployment. Again, I tend to go back to that whole analogy between decommissioning and deployment, because I do think that that there's no reason for decommissioning to be that hard of a thing to do when you've got 20 years of deployment experience. Yeah. One thing I was noticing, I was thinking, I'm talking to a couple clients recently about, related to the Wild West era and kind of the echoes of those days, the sort of, like they say, they can detect the echoes of an earthquake, a month later. It's a lot of the carriers don't have very good handle on what's actually out there in terms of their equipment. It's surprising, and we knew this. I mean, we've known this for a decade. In fact, I remember working on a project 10 years ago that was diving deep for a carrier into what exactly are they showing on their books versus what's really out there, and fairly high percentage of misses between what they're showing and what's physically out there. So that creates a problem with decommissioning, because you're hiring people to go out and you think they're going to go out and find one thing and they're going to find another, but they do want to look back on their asset tracking, asset management, and to the extent that that could cause you problems in decommissioning, you want to get a real good picture of your current state as far as knowing with your data what is out there, because we're obviously these carriers now have tens of thousands of sites, and I've always said that cell sites are like snowflakes. No two are alike, and you want to make sure your data. So there's a lot of planning and going in this too, and that's one thing I'd want to emphasize to anybody who's watching this. Yeah. You can't plan too much for this sort of thing.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Again, like talking to the People Plus report I did, that does seem like that is key. I mean, if you don't have everything lined up and in place, and think about all the things that could crop up. I mean, you have to be ready for the contingencies. I mean, you don't know what's going to happen. Like you said, I mean, even going to a cell site, like you said, if you go out to a site, it happens to be a mom and pop cell site, and they're not allowed. They have a big dog on property who's not going to let you get to the site, or I mean, there's small little things that you're not wouldn't even think about, but that could mess up the whole process there. You really have to be planning.
Right, and to your point, let's just take that dog example, and there are different scenarios that are not that different from the dog. There's a guy who won't let you get on the elevator.
Yeah.
To get up to the roof. That's why the strategy of getting as a carrier, a large carrier, and you've got to decommission 10,000 sites, for instance, or whatever the number is, you don't want to be dealing with 5,000 people who have a dog, or that's sort of the prototype of that, or the image of what we're talking about here. Yeah. You do want to get these tier 1 vendors who will then bring in the local vendors who know the landlords, maybe even the local site act people who did the lease negotiations, and they know them, and they've been in the community for years. That kind of stuff helps a lot with that. Yeah. It's like all politics are local, all network infrastructure deployment and decommissioning ultimately is fairly local too. So. Yeah, and that kind of brings up a point too. That was someone had brought up when I was talking to them about this too. Is when you go back to these sites and you have to recondition them, or if you're somehow dropping a site, let's say. And I know that's not very common, but sometimes if you are decommissioning a complete site, part of the agreement initially might have been that the tenant has to recondition the site to as new condition, or whatever the condition of that site was. Yes.
When the tower was first put there, and if that was 20 years ago, who knows what the site looked like back then? The people might not even be around anymore who were there at that time, and so the new tower owner or the new landlord could say, hey, that rooftop used to be gold plated or something. Who knows?
Sure.
So,
Yeah, and that's where having those people who are going to go into the contracts, understand exactly what's in the lease agreements. I mean, those are more mom and pop kind of things than I think that are typically, have with the big guys. But yeah, that's the sort of thing will happen. Again, I mean, I think in Spectrum plays into this too, and what a carrier spectrum situation is, because that drives their tower density and site density and that sort of thing. But it depends on how many actual towers are coming down and where you're vacating the site. In my view, I sure you're going to have that sort of thing happen. Probably not one of your biggest issues, because at the end of the day, if that site was good for 2G, it's probably going to be a pretty valuable site in your network for 3G and beyond. In particularly when you're going from 3G to 4G. But again, that also has to do with the other two things are going to, I think, are bigger drivers of whether towers actually come down. And again, I don't see a whole lot of towers coming down. Just pedestrian observation, just driving around in the country, anyone can. When was the last time you saw someone tearing down a tower?
That's pretty rare. That's pretty rare. Yeah.
Yeah, it's that three-dimensional piece of real estate that's up there at 100 feet above the ground, and whether it's on a rooftop, water tower, or a monopole, that's some pretty valuable real estate. Whether it's the current network or another one, and we can get into the situation with the tower companies and how this all impacts the tower companies, but they certainly recognize that,
Yeah.
And when I was mentioning spectrum earlier, I mean, if it sort of depends on your bandwidth. I mean, one of the factors is what your density of sites is going to be. 700 is going to propagate a lot better, but even with that, with the just incredible explosion in demand for data that shows no sign of abating, and in fact it's quite the opposite. You're talking 150% year-over-year growth in data usage. That just means that three-dimensional piece of real estate floating in the air is just going to be much, much more valuable as time goes on. So I don't see a ton of physical towers coming down. I mean, there are always going to be cases where maybe one thing that might, and it's off topic, but when we get into the small cell market and how that's going to eventually, and the technology around that could start driving some changes with that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. I'm not saying the densification aspect of it. You're right. I mean, it's going to be pretty rare when a carrier does get rid of a site, because that's a pretty big decision, because getting a site back is definitely much more difficult nowadays than it used to be. And so if you've got
very good point. Yeah, once you're there, you kind of, even if maybe you don't necessarily need it right this minute, you can kind of bank it a little bit, and you've got that available. It doesn't mean there aren't physical changes. I mean, you do, and this is one of the things where it comes to renegotiating leases when they come up, or when you're, whatever the event is related to the decommissioning. A lot of these had to do with square footage or, linear feet on the tower. And now part of the technology here is you're using much smaller stuff. You're no longer in the case. We went back to, we were talking about Iden a minute ago, or the 2G. We have this big, huge shelter that you could throw a small party in. Where now we're having cabinets the size of a small file cabinet, and then a couple remote units up on top of the tower, and we're no longer talking about tons and tons of heavy cable. If you look at these big multi-tenant sites where you've just got tons of cable going up the tower, now you're talking about a fiber or a little thing going up there, and it's not so much. So the physical need that you have is not that great, and in that you like to think, well, that's great. The tower company, I just go back to the tower company. I say, I don't need 100 square feet anymore. I need 25 on the ground. But the tower companies, they're smart about this. Extremely sophisticated. They know what they're selling. They're selling you essentially access to, well, the radio network. Radio. That's what RAN stands for, right? It's radio access, and it's really less to do with how much space you're taking up. Yeah. So I mean that's a big factor, and and if you want, we could talk about the impact of the tower companies, because I don't see them slow. I see them doing really well right now. Their
Oh
numbers
yeah,
are
yeah, I mean,
phenomenal.
yeah. I mean, any tower event you go to now, I mean, the tower CEOs, they are a very happy bunch, and
They are.
they have great confidence, that's for sure.
If any CEOs are out there, the tower companies, and you guys are doing so well, you got to invite us to the party, have a drink. But no, absolutely it is because it'd be one thing if say, okay, well, my ice loading and my wind loading is down because I've shrunk the piece parts I need for this on your tower. The tower company has a perfectly good point and say, well, yeah, that's fine, but you're putting out 10 times the bit rate. I've got essentially a virtual pipe that you're pushing data bits out from the top of my tower, and you're getting 10x the revenue and 10x 5x the revenue and 10x the data, and especially as we move on to voice over LTE, it's all packet switched anyway. But the tower companies are starting to look at, or not even starting, they've been for a number of years looking at different models on pricing, and they're going to get their piece, and it's not incredibly unreasonable from their point of view either. They own a really critical piece of the puzzle to make this whole thing work, and they put a lot of money into it. It's funny I say that because I've always been on the opposite side of a negotiating table with the tower company, but yeah.
Yeah, but it does seem like you're right. I mean, it's just the look of the tower is just changing. But like you said, I mean, it's becoming less of a shelter at the bottom, all the cables running up, to now it's the remote radio heads are up there, the fiber's up there, and like I said, that does maybe in some cases require a tower company to brace the tower differently or reinforce maybe the upper part of the tower. So obviously they can make changes there in the contract with the carrier and figure out different ways to make it all work for them at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I've seen. It's funny. I mean, I have definitely seen a lot of structural modifications, really widespread on a say a given 3,000 site deployment in certain markets, where a surprising number going from 2G to 3G, a surprising number of sites require structural mods. But I will say the biggest driver for that is your backhaul strategy, whether or not you're using microwave, because those big microwave antennas really do drive a lot, the majority of the wind loading if microwave's in play. And then if microwave's not in play, you're really just talking about RAN antennas, and you're not going to. That's sort of independent of whether you're commissioning or decommissioning or 2G or 3G or 4G. It just depends on where you are and how many antennas you need, how many sectors you need, and what type of antennas you're using. The newer antennas are smaller, so RAN antennas are smaller. But I see backhaul, again off topic, but backhaul is a much bigger driver on your requirement for structural mods on sites, in my opinion.
Yeah.
These remote radio units are tiny little things. They go up there, but they're like bread boxes. And
nothing nowadays. Yeah. No, that's a good point. I mean, obviously the fiber market is becoming pretty hot as well. I mean, I think initially it seemed like microwave was being used quite a bit, in areas where you just took the fiber out to the site. But that does seem like the fiber companies are getting pretty aggressive and expanding their reach. And that's going to allow, because again, these towers, they need as much backhaul as they can get. I mean, you almost have to future-proof this because you don't have to go out there 5 years from now and have to redo it all over again. So
I couldn't agree more. I do think fiber is the closest thing to future-proofing you can do for backhaul, and there are a lot of people have fairly passionate opinions on whether microwave is a great solution or not. For the kind of quality of service or network availability and in terms of whether microwaves, some people say in high winds it can disrupt calls and fog and rain and things like that. But microwave works pretty well. But I agree, you get fiber out to the site and your problems are generally going to be solved if, especially if you got a good contract with the fiber provider and there's some maybe competition available. But yeah, as I say, not to get too much off topic, but structural mods shouldn't necessarily be a big impact from or a big result of having to go from, say, certainly not from 3G to 4G, unless you're just reconfiguring the tower completely with a bunch of new antennas, RAN antennas, and and again, backhaul if you're going into microwave. But you see a lot more of that outside the U.S. than you do in the U.S. Much more outside the U.S.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I guess maybe one final topic then before we wrap this one up here is, you touched on it a bit earlier, is kind of the recycling aspect of it. That's become definitely a big driver in the industry. Companies are looking to reduce their green footprint, and when it comes to decommissioning networks, sometimes in a lot of cases it's a lot of old equipment that's coming down from these sites, and I guess the old model used to be, hey, you can just resell it to a different market, or there's always a nice market for old equipment. But it does seem like that market is perhaps drying up a bit. From some of the companies I talk to, it seems like a lot of the developing markets now aren't looking for 2G equipment anymore. They're looking to deploy their own 3G and LTE equipment. So
absolutely. I mean, just if you're in a developing country in Africa and you've got Huawei coming in there with the financing power of the China Development Bank behind them to give you a loan at almost zero interest with very little relatively small loan qualifications, and all kinds of incentives, you're going to deploy the Huawei 4G or the ZTE 4G. You're not interested in someone's hand-me-down, 2G or even 3G stuff. And that's kind of it's funny you say that. So because it's true, it never ceases to surprise me when I go to, theoretically poor countries, and you look around and you're like, maybe a poor country, pretty daggone good cell networks.
Yeah.
But to your point, so there's sort of recycling, and then there's reselling. The dumb stuff, the stuff that's not intelligent, generators. Generators comes to mind. To some extent, antennas, but even those, there's been so much evolution and progress in technology on antennas. It's kind of the same thing with the radios. But some people may buy them. If you're a carrier, generators you can always resell, but at the end of the day, why would you take a generator out of a site if you're going to continue to use the site? The tower and everything. You're not going to. Batteries. Batteries present a hazmat challenge, and it always present a logistics challenge because there's so many requirements around transportation. So it's like everything else in this kind of end-to-end decommissioning world. You want to have a vendor who's experienced at breaking this stuff down. Now I'm talking recycling.
Yep.
And getting out the precious metals that are in there. There's gold to be found and that kind of thing, and recycling what can be recycled. Related to that, by the way, is this whole, and this is going to be much, much more important as in the future, although it's very important now, is anything with data on it needs to be certified as cleaned, and you need to be, you the vendor need to be able to withstand an audit that shows that, yes, every single thing coming in here that could conceivably have data on it is being wiped clean before it either gets, it should be certified that it's been either completely destroyed or, God forbid, if you sell it, it better be daggone clean. It's sort of like selling your personal computer. Do you want to, I personally would never sell my personal computer because I'm not convinced, unless I guess I took the hard drive out of it, But that's an issue. And, so there's that. Recycling, and then the best way to handle it if you're a carrier, if you're any wireless carrier, your business is not selling used telecom equipment. There are companies out there, especially, and I go back to this tier 1 concept of a tier 1 vendor, and you get, that's part of his or their team, It's either they do it themselves or they've got subs. And these subs typically are going to be maybe located in a couple places in the country where this stuff can all go to one or a few facilities. But you don't want to be in the business of, managing the recycler, directly if you can avoid it. It's just part of the overall solution. And the other part of that is a consignment vendor, so which should be part of the solution as well. So let's take an example of a generator. Okay, I don't need this generator anymore, but it's perfectly good. It was here for 5 years, but we only turned it on every month just to make sure it still ran and kept it. There was a thunderstorm back in 2009. It was on for 2 hours. These things are they're pretty good stuff, and there's a market for them. And the best thing there is, as a carrier, You just work out a deal with your decommissioning vendor, and you split the proceeds 50-50. Is pretty fair. It's very much like the idea of a consignment vendor in your neighborhood, if or in your town. If you got a bunch of grandma's sofas and I don't know. I hope your grandma's okay, but you know what I mean. A lot of old furniture and stuff, and you don't want to go through the trouble of selling it on Craigslist yourself or whatever. You take it to a consignment store. They get 50%. You get 50%. You're good to go. Exact same scenario with anything that can be resold. Yeah. Fencing, cables, to some extent cables. There's a lot of cable out there.